For Jerry on the stream, his question was, can you make the presentation slides available with the speaker, or alternatively with the speaker? We can't see the speaker's notes. For those who have been in the room, you know there haven't been any yet. But we are making the projection available now because we're going to start using the screen some. We're probably not going to go too long. Dan, when are we officially supposed to let out?
You mean for lunch?
Yeah, for lunch. Noon. Okay. All right. So we'll go about 35 minutes. Maybe do some more questions and answers. But this is one of those really important ones before the afternoon sessions, because here's what we all know internally, whether we verbalize it or not. We don't like doing things that we don't know why we're doing them. Raise your hand if you loved algebra. There's a few. True or false? You knew why you loved algebra. Yeah. Everybody who loves algebra knows why. And everyone else hates algebra. Why? They don't know why they're doing it. When you teach people, one of the most valuable things you can teach them is why. Sometimes we hear from members in congregations, I sure wish the preacher wouldn't spend so much time in the Old Testament. While you as a student may be a little advanced in your studies, maybe looking at that and go, that person's not mature. The problem may not be maturity. The problem may be they've never been told why it's valuable. But Paul told us, didn't he? Turn to Romans chapter 15. Romans chapter 15, Paul writes this. Beginning in verse 1, we then who are strong ought to bear with the scruples of the weak. I'm using the New King James here. And not to please ourselves. In chapter 14, he's been writing about the eating of meat. He's been writing about not offending a brother who is weak. He's been writing about caring more about that person's soul than your liberty. So he then says, we then who are strong, and isn't it the case that most of the time everybody thinks they're the strong party? So who doesn't this apply to? It applies to everybody. The reality is, if you're looking at this scripture, you're going, I'm the strong party, I've made the right decision, I've determined the right choice on this matter of liberty or license or doctrine, you're accountable to this verse. We then who are strong ought to bear with the scruples of the weak and not to please ourselves. Preachers, don't ride a hobby horse in the pulpit. Don't keep preaching on the same subject week in and week out when everybody started to tune you out, because you're not communicating effectively. The work of a preacher doesn't begin and end in the pulpit. It begins in his personal interactions with people who are lost or struggling or weak or strong and need to be taught further. True or false? Paul told Timothy the things that he had heard among many witnesses, commit to faithful men. True. So he's saying you take the people who are strong and you work with them to make them stronger so that they who are strong can teach those who are able to become strong. He wants you to produce more teachers, not be the only one ever talking. But notice this, he says don't please yourself. Don't make your decisions based upon what makes you happy. Do what's best for the other person. True or false? Jesus said the foundation of all the law and the prophets was to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and to do what's best for yourself. No. False. And to love your neighbor as yourself. And he said, on this hangs all the law and the prophets. Why in the world should we teach the Old Testament? Because on those two principles from the book of Deuteronomy hangs all the law and the prophets. It explains to us what Jesus said the greatest commandments in all the law were. To love the Lord our God and to love one another. But Paul continues on. He says, let each of us please his neighbor for his good, leading to edification, for building up. For even Christ did not please himself, but as it is written, the reproaches of those who reproached you fell on me. For whatsoever things were written before were written for our learning, that we through the patience, that word is to bear up under a load, that we through endurance, that we through bearing up under the struggles of dealing with those who are weak, and seeing the struggles of those in the Old Testament who did it right, and following their example. By the way, that's what Hebrews chapter 10, Hebrews chapter 11, and Hebrews chapter 12 are all about. Here's what you ought to be doing. Here's your examples of those who did it by faith, and therefore look to Christ and go do it. He says, for whatsoever things were written before were written for our learning, that we through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have what? Hope. Do you understand? Can you help someone else understand the reason we ought to teach the Old Testament is it is the foundation of our hope? When you teach them about Abraham, don't teach them just facts. Don't just tell them a story. Why is it that Moses spends 13 chapters telling us that Abraham's going to have a son, and one chapter telling us about the life of the son? Because the story's not about Abraham and it's not about Isaac. It's about God's covenants. It's about God's promises. And the entire chapter that is about Isaac is about God saying, the promises I gave your father and the covenant that I made with your father, I will keep with you. And as I did to him, if you're faithful to me, I'll do to you. The story's about God. The story's about the covenant. The story's about our hope. Not just a story, not just facts and figures. Not just a person who lived so many years ago we can't contemplate how he lived. Teach them why. So it's my job in the next 20 minutes to tell you why in the world you should care about a church website. And it's not because we want to make sure our website's better than the Church of Christ down the road because we're competing for members. Nope. Number one, we're not competing for members. And anybody who thinks we are has missed the point of the gospel. Because there are far more lost people out there than there are any of the congregations in Memphis. We're not competing for members. We're striving to teach the lost. So the only reason you should care about a website or anything else you do in a local work is because it matters to the lost. It matters to the saved, and it gets people closer to Christ. If it doesn't do one of those three things, it's not part of your work. Or it shouldn't be. So then, why should you care about the first impression? Some of us were told growing up, you never get a second opportunity to make a first impression. And you don't. Once the first impression has been made, it's done. And that impression will carry more weight than every successive impression that you make until you reach a deeper relationship with someone. A friend of mine was traveling. He was going to see family up in Kansas. He was going there and they were going to be there over the weekend. He's a member of the church, so what did he do? He got on the internet to find out what time the local congregation was going to be assembling. Got on their website. Got the worship times. Wasn't 100% sure about it, so he drove by the building, and the sign on the front of the building had a different set of worship times. Showed up on Sunday, both sets of times were wrong. Now, that left an impression. As a result of that, Luke Griffin decided, he's one of the guys who works at House to House, Heart to Heart, we've got to help congregations fix this problem. So they started a project a number of years ago that was set forth to do that. And it was set forth with this goal. If a congregation mails out House to House, Heart to Heart, House to House, Heart to Heart, if the congregation mails out one mail out at least a minimum of one mail out every 12 months, House to House, Heart to Heart will build and maintain a website for them, free of charge, or included in the charge of one mail out. What's the math on that? Let me go to the wide. Maybe that'll work. To send out a house-to-house mailing, you have to send out at least 1,000 copies. Now, you can have 1,000 copies printed and for less cost have them sent in boxes to your church building. That's not as effective as having them show up in people's mailboxes, though. But the cost for that is about $200. If you spend at your congregation $200 one time a year, you can get a website built for you, maintained for you, and kept up to date for you. Now, it's got a limited scope because it's on a very limited budget. It's called free. But here's the key. At least once a year, when you send out house to house, you go check that house to house mailing and you go, well, are our worship times right? Because generally speaking, if you're going to spend $200 to put a piece of mail in front of somebody's mailbox, you might want to check it and make sure that the worship times are right and the contact information's right. So about once a year, you go double check that. You go, oh, that's wrong. So you send an email to house, hey, before you print that, our worship times need to be changed. And guess what House to House does? They go, oh, look, they've got a website. We also need to change the website to match the times. So for $200 a year, you get a website that has the correct worship times and the correct contact information and correct information about your congregation, and you don't have to build a thing. But what's the point that I'm trying to get to here? It's not a promotional ad for House to House. It's why wouldn't you go through some steps to make sure that people who are trying to come to your building can actually show up at the right time to be there for your services? And not only that, a website is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for you to make contact with someone who may never, prior to that opportunity of contact, actually choose to step foot inside your building. The why of a website why should we have an up-to-date website? Why is a website, when it comes to the internet, a central need of a congregation? Here's the answer. Because in the world of technology that we live in this country and most countries where technology is pervasive, people will find you online before they ever walk through the door. Your first impression with a visitor is almost never in person. And that's why it's important. It's important to have a website that's not advertising the 2013 barbecue. It's important to have a website that does not read down at the bottom, like one that I just visited a while back, copyright 2002. Guess what that says? For 17 years, nobody's paid attention to this thing. Well, if they haven't cared about their website for 17 years, why am I going to go listen to them teach me about the Bible? We need to be careful in congregations to not overreach. Sometimes we do that. Sometimes we've got somebody who's effective at something and we dump a bunch of stuff on their plate and they're so busy they can't do anything effectively. Do you remember that passage where Timothy was taught by Paul, you find people who are faithful and you teach them to do things to teach others to do things? Why is it there are congregations where the preacher's the only one doing anything? I guarantee it. Because the preacher's never gone to someone in person throughout that congregation, to men who are faithful, and said, I need help. Will you help me? I'm not talking about standing behind the pulpit and saying, we need to get busy, we need to be working. That's not asking someone for help. True or false? Jesus found His disciples and gathered the 12 by standing in front of an audience saying, I need disciples. Well, if Jesus showed us the right way to do it, why aren't we doing it that way? If we need someone to do something, then ask them personally. But that same idea follows through to communication on a website. If you want someone to have an interaction with you through a website, sign up for an email list, get something that you're offering, then you need to ask them. And there also needs to be something for them in return. You go to a grocery store. As you're there in the grocery store, you're in the checkout line, you're buying the things that you need, and the person in the checkout line says, do you receive our text messages? And you go, no, I don't. What's your first thought? Well, why should I? What's in it for me? I mean, this is just the society we live in. If I'm going to get text messages from you, there ought to be some value I get out of it. To which the person who's behind the counter will say, well, we send out discounts and special coupon codes that are only available in our text messages. Well, the why is, I like discounts, I like paying less money at the grocery store. Now you I don't really want to give you my phone number. So you may choose not to. But guess what? The conversation never would have happened, and the discussion never would have been brought up, and the contemplation of you being added to the text message list never would have crossed your mind had the person not asked. So part of an effective website is this. You utilize it to ask for opportunities. And you give them something in return for free. Not them. Please don't spam people. Please don't buy email addresses online. Almost all of them are just empty email addresses with no humans attached to them. But you can buy them. You can waste the Lord's money. Please don't do that. But if people show up at your website and your website is up to date and it's maintained and it's orderly and there's an opportunity to get something for free, someone might say, you know what? That actually sounds appealing. I'd like to have a copy of that. It's, by the way, the same thing that Jody Apple does in his radio program. He offers the notes from a particular series, or a CD of a particular series, or a download of a particular series, preferably something that costs very little money but is valuable to someone and specifically connects with something they're already interested in. So you might have a page on your site that's geared toward the distinctiveness of the church. Maybe you've got an article or a series of articles, or what in the web world we call it a landing page. You've got something that's driving traffic towards something about a particular subject. If you're going to have someone land on that page that's about a particular subject, shouldn't you offer them something that's connected to that subject on that page? Again, we're thinking about what's the logical next step. So, let's chain a few of these things together. If they see something on Facebook that connects them to your website, they go to the website, they clicked the link because they were interested in it. That tells you something. If they weren't interested in it, they wouldn't have clicked the link. They would have stayed on Facebook. So they clicked the link, they went to your website, and now that they're on your website, you give them something related to that subject. And in exchange, you ask for something in return. A way to contact them. Why are websites the central issue for congregations in the Lord's body when it comes to the internet? 2 reasons. It is your first impression, and it is one of the most effective means for getting contact, personal contact, with a visitor. Because that visitor may never walk through your door, but they're already on your website. That's the why. Because we're not about pretty church websites, and we're not about having the latest and greatest. We're about making sure that we can make contact with people who are looking for the truth. And a website is one way to do that. But a website that's out of date, a website that has wrong information, a website that's ineffective, a website that's not maintained, isn't effective. Now, I am the first to admit I am not always perfect at practicing what I preach, and sometimes my website gets behind. As a matter of fact, it's behind right now, but it is being fixed. But let's face it, we all have a responsibility to tell the truth about subjects even we're not perfect about, right? Okay, just wanted to be sure we're all still preaching on sin, and we're all still struggling with it too. Okay? That's why we have grace. Here's what we need to learn. We need to learn how to communicate. We need to learn how to be effective. We're going to try and do that throughout the course of this seminar. As we come back, I want to kind of set the stage for what you should expect. When we come back this afternoon, we're actually going to spend part of this afternoon's lessons and tomorrow's lessons building a website. My goal is, if you have a laptop with you, or if we have access to a computer for you, we'll see if we can make something work. My goal is, if you're here today and tomorrow, when this seminar is finished, you will have a completed website that you can start using for you to communicate to people who are lost. But you will also have the tools necessary to build a website for a congregation, whether your home congregation that you're no longer at because you're here at school, or your home congregation where you're preaching and where you're ministering and you're not a student at school, or somebody out there on the stream. The reality is, these are effective tools if managed properly and done properly. And we need to be using them. So I'm going to do everything I can to get you past all of the roadblocks. For 15 years, I've been building church websites. and making all of the mistakes. All of them. The wrong design, the wrong template, the wrong system, the wrong code. You name it, I've done it. And what I'm going to do is move you past as many of those mistakes as possible so that in a very short amount of time, you learn how to do things in an effective way and don't learn any of the mistakes. We may not be 100% perfect at this, but here's what the goal is. You're here in school for the students. You're here in school. You're going through these 2 years so that when you get out, you're more effective than you would have been had you not shown up here. Like it or not, you live in a digital world and a physical one. You have to be effective in a digital world and a physical one. So, my advice is find teachers and instructors who can teach you about the digital world and the physical one. This is not a pat on the back. This is me telling you that's what I do. I regularly spend my money to learn things from people who know things I don't know. You're spending your time, your effort, 2 years to learn things from Dan and from Keith and from others who know things you don't know. That doesn't end when you leave school. That better keep going. That's, by the way, why the MOST class is here. One of the reasons why I helped create the MOST class by way of the technology is because I want that instruction. I want my boys, whether we live here in Memphis or not, when they're older, to go through all those classes. But if we don't plan, and if we don't prepare, and if we don't learn at least the basic minimum tools, we won't be effective. So I'm going to try and get you through all the basic effective tools. Give you tools, I'm going to teach you tools, I'm going to teach you things that will save you untold hours. I don't want to calculate how many hours of my life those mistakes and those wrong paths have led me down. But that's what Dan does. Dan gets up here and talks about history and archaeology. And he leads you towards books that are good and away from books that are terrible, because he spent hours reading the books that were terrible so you didn't have to. That's what we do as teachers. Comments or questions? By the way, first and foremost, did I answer the question of why? Anybody not yet clear on why? And this isn't to put you on the spot. This is just we want to make sure the why is clear, because the rest doesn't matter unless the why is clear. Okay? Any other comments or questions?
Can you explain what a podcast is?
Yes, sir, I can. A podcast is a fancy word for I want to subscribe to a piece of content, and I want it delivered to me so I don't have to go get it. Okay? In other words, the term came from iPods. Back in the day, Apple brought out the first iPod, and one of the things that you could do is you could take iTunes on your computer and you could subscribe to a feed. The content in that feed would download to your computer when it was released, and then you'd connect up that USB cable to your iPod, and it would go from your computer to the iPod, so that as you were traveling, listening, had headphones on, whatever, you could listen to that content that was downloaded sometime the night before. Podcasting is a delivery method whereby somebody puts pre-recorded content online, schedules it generally for release at a certain point. It gets released and downloaded directly to those who have subscribed to it. It's a very effective means in some areas. It is not effective for everything, but it definitely is a very useful tool. We'll talk about more. By the way, it is generally a website that drives that functionality. So if your website isn't being maintained, you probably don't have a podcast either. Because those two things are generally connected. Did that answer the question?
Is
It is a podcast and an email and a YouTube channel and social media. By the way, something that we're going to get into tomorrow afternoon. No, tomorrow morning, 11 o'clock. Your reason to be here tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock is, while I do put a lot of work into the Admonition Daily Devotional, it would not be possible if I didn't use automation. One of the things that I have spent about the last 3 years working on is developing the ability to automate things that computers do better than I do. And that is repetitive tasks. And so I am going to give you a glimpse at 11 o'clock into what is possible if you take the things that I teach you about websites and connect them to services that automate things, because it changes your life. Let's say you have to put an article up for the website every week, or you have to post the sermon from the website every week, or you've got to do this or that or whatever. And you want to post it on Facebook, and you want to send it out in an email. You could do all of those things individually, and it would take you an hour or two. Or you could automate them, and you could do it in about 5 minutes a week. Now, is that worth some time figuring out? It is. So 11 o'clock tomorrow morning, you got to show back up, because that's what we're going to talk about. There are some very simple ways to do it. You do not, by the way, there is no code involved. I don't like writing code. It's not for me. So for those who are like, oh, this is going to be way above my head, it's not. As a matter of fact, it's built to not be above your head. But it is something that builds on the hours before it. So you might need those. Any other comments or questions?
How much does it cost to build a website?
The cost to build a website is a very dependent question because it depends on who's building it and how it's being built. The way that I'm going to teach you, there will be, for the students, the school is actually going to run the site and going to host it for you. For a congregation, the way I recommend and what I teach people will cost them a small upfront cost for a tool that is involved in the website, and it will cost them an ongoing cost of two things. A domain name registration, which is you going out and saying, hey, we are the Collierville Church of Christ and we own colliervillecoc.org. That's your domain name. That requires a registration with a company out there called ICANN, and you have to pay for that once a year. Costs about $10 to $15 a year. That's one piece. That's a yearly renewal. The other piece is the hosting. You have to have a server out there on the internet that hosts the website, that stores the files, that when people go, I want to go to colliervillecoc.org, that server delivers them the content. The systems that I recommend is a combination of systems that I've worked to organize through the company or through doing this for clients and for congregations. And the ongoing cost, if you run it yourself and you do the maintenance yourself, which I teach you how to do, is $11.50 a month. Well within any congregation's budget to get an effective website that stays up to date, that's secure, that's maintained. One of the systems that I use also does backups. It's included in that price. And does security updates for the server, because the last thing you want is a server out there that's not getting updated for security patches, because then it's going to get hacked and then all sorts of fun stuff ends up on your website. Don't do that. I said I made all the mistakes for you, so you don't have to make them. Any other questions?
You mentioned at the grocery store that they ask you about getting text messages from them. Is it a good thing to try to promote that on your website? You're asking people for their email address. Why not ask them for their phone number as well?
That is certainly an option. There are some ways to do that. It doesn't, interestingly, unless the person is connected to a physical location, generally speaking, the text messages aren't as effective in generating results as emails are, percentage-wise. But they do reach a different audience. So that's why text messaging is effective in some areas. If somebody's connected to a physical location like the grocery store or whatever, and they're being reminded to go there, that's when they are effective. So it's all about maintaining it. They're also, right now, email is a much more stabilized system, and the tools are less expensive to maintain it on a continual basis and be effective. Text message is still not a perfect medium, and so it's just a completely different system. What I will say is the automation that I'll teach you, while we won't go into text messages can also drive text messages. So if you have a congregation where you want to send out an email to your members every week with the bulletin, you also want to deliver it to some people who want it via a text message instead of an email, you can do that. And you can automate it. And you can not do two things. You can do one thing. So I'm going to be quiet now unless there's any other questions. Yes, another question. Yes, you may. So there's actually a thing, when we decided to name it Truth FM, unfortunately we were not aware that there's a group in Kenya that's not associated with a church that's not Truth.fm, what we're involved in. So there's a denominational group that uses the name in Africa of Truth.fm or Truth FM. That's not us. We are working with foreign languages. That is something Truth FM does. We run stations that are not in English. One of them is a Hungarian station. It's for Budapest. One of the members over at Somerville is a missionary in Hungary, and we've worked with them to start that. It's all Hungarian content. It's all foreign language. There's not a single lick of English on the entire station. That's only possible because of the guy in Virginia who's much smarter than I am. But that being said, we are interested in creating stations for mission works and for foreign languages and working with missionaries to get content recorded. The struggle we had with Hungary was they said, well, we're interested in doing radio, and they ran into a barrier. They went to all of the radio stations there in Budapest, and they offered to pay for airtime. But all of the stations are owned by Catholics. They were turned down. They would not even name a price that the church could pay to get airtime in Budapest. So they said, okay, well, we were going to have to figure out some other way. Just so happened that same week that happened, I got in contact with the missionary, and he said, I didn't even know this was possible. And I said, well, it's possible, and it ended up costing them less than 30 minutes of airtime would have cost them had they even been able to buy it, but they couldn't buy it. So now they're on 24 hours a day. Same thing is possible in every language in the world if there's someone local who can get the content recorded. And we can teach you how to do that, and it's very inexpensive, and it can be done and managed and maintained, and we're happy to work with you to do that. But so that's just something to stick away in your mind. Technology makes things possible that would never be able to be possible if you couldn't automate it, and if you can't use technology to do what technology does well. So, all right, you are dismissed. We